But if you remember the last time that we were all together, what was happening is Paul, he made some comments about the resurrection, almost got killed, got taken into custody, brought before the Sanhedrin. It was determined he would be moved then to Caesarea to avoid a plot by the Jews to kill him. And while in Caesarea, Paul was brought before the governor Felix, and a case was made against him by the Jews. Tertullus was acting then as the orator or the lawyer. And one of the things we dug into last time was how a trial typically went down in Rome during the first century. And we also talked a little bit about the Pax Romana and the implications of that, what it enabled in the Roman Empire. And due to those Pax Romana conditions, that was a period of time in history when the gospel message was just, it was able to spread due to all those conditions being just right. In other words, it would not have been able to spread if Christ had come sooner or if he had come later. That was the perfect period of time. Of course, we know God had a little something to do with bringing that all about. Now, the Jews had brought these charges against Paul, and there were three primarily political treason, religious heresy, and desecration of the temple. Now, none of those, they were all bogus claims, right? The only one that, maybe in the Jews' eyes could have been legitimate to them could have been the religious heresy, because he was saying some things that they necessarily didn't agree with. But the other two claims were totally fictitious. So he was innocent, of course, but we know he took the opportunity to expound about the resurrection and other parts of God's plan. We were also introduced to this woman, Drusilla, who was Jewish, and we're going to meet her family tonight. And so we ended last time in verse 27 of Acts 24. And we have Felix, Governor Felix, keeping Paul around for a couple years and making no final decision while he just kind of waited for a bribe and used Paul as maybe some sort of entertainment. And just wanted to read verse 27 of Acts 24. It said, "But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound." You'll remember perhaps we talked about how the Jews, they had lodged an official complaint against him, against Felix, and he was being replaced. So he was trying to engender favor in their eyes. It didn't seem to work out too well for him in the long run. Now, in tonight's Bible study, Acts chapter 25, we'll go through it. It can generally be divided into four basic sections. So, four basic sections, and those sections are, number one, the transfer of power, and that's verses 1 through 5, and that's where Festus replaces Felix. Oh, hey, my screen is backwards. That's not very useful, is it? Let's see what we can do to fix this. What good is a screen if it is backwards? That's probably a little bit better, isn't it? All right. So, uh, number one is this transfer of power, verses 1 through 5. Felix is replaced by Festus. Next, we have verses 6 through 12, and that is Paul's appeal to Caesar. The third part of this would be Festus deliberating and seeking help from King Agrippa, or at least input from King Agrippa, since King Agrippa was Jewish. So this is just a delay. Could be really called a deliberation, though, more than a delay, whereas Felix's case, he was really just delaying. And then the fourth part of Acts 25 is the setup. So the setup for Paul's hearing before Agrippa. And And then verse 26, we'll get into that in much more detail. So that's kind of how Acts 25 is broken down. So Acts chapter 25, verse 1. Acts 25, verse 1. Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So we have this distance from Caesarea to Jerusalem, Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem. So just this distance here. It's about 60 miles one way. So, of course, it depends where you are traveling from in each city, but roughly 60 miles one way, and it would take a couple of days. So these, takes longer if you're walking, takes much less time if you're rich and you have people to or animals to bring you along. So, depending how you travel, could take a couple days, could take more. Really depends on your means of travel. So now we are introduced to this guy, Porcius Festus. And I told you last time, don't want to go into him last time, wanted to wait until we really cover him in a lot more detail. So I'll share my screen again. And what we have is, we have the buttons not working. Oh, I see. There we go. So we have 6 different governors, Roman governors mentioned in the scriptures. Now, Festus, Porcius Festus, he was governor of Judea in AD 59 to 62. Now, I'm not going to read all these for you on the phone hookup multiple times along with all the scriptures, so I'll just mention their names. But you can, they're in most history books. So you have Quirinius, governor of Syria, Pilate, governor of Judea, Sergius Paulus, governor of Cyprus, and Gallio, governor of Achaia, then Felix and Festus, governors of Judea. So kind of successive governors here all mentioned in the New Testament. So Governor Festus succeeded Felix, and he inherited a politically volatile situation. Remember, we're right around this time of 59, 60 AD, depending what source you look at, and things are starting to get kind of tense. Paul's unresolved case was one of these things, but as we talked about last time and the previous time, the Jewish unrest was rising. Zealots were increasing in number, specifically as well these Sicarii. They were increasing in number with their long daggers. As a result, tensions in Rome were escalating. And the people in Rome are saying, listen, what is going on down there in Judea? What a mess. Are we going to have to intervene? Well, yeah, they were going to. Because from, let's see, 6 or 7 years from this point, you have the beginning of the First Jewish-Roman War, which lasted from 66 to 70 AD. And Josephus credits this guy Festus with suppressing robbers, suppressing Sicarii during his tenure, and repairing a lot of infrastructure. So Mr. Bruce, F.F. Bruce in the New Testament history, regards Festus as more than just a much more competent administrator than Felix. He was still politically cautious, but he was more middle of the road, more balanced, and a much better administrator. He accomplished a great deal of things in just 2 to 3 years. So he was much more highly thought of than Felix. Now, Festus's first name was Porcius, and that name suggests a noble lineage. So Festus would have likely have been of the equestrian rank in the social hierarchy in Roman society. And if you're wondering what on earth is that social hierarchy all about, I thought some of you may find it interesting to maybe just real briefly go through this. You may be familiar with it, you may not, but since the entirety of the New Testament takes place under the Roman Empire, or while the Roman Empire is in effect, I should say, it would be good to just kind of have an idea about how this all worked out, or I'm sorry, how this was structured, because it applies to a lot of Paul's explanations. It applies to a lot of things Jesus Christ would have dealt with in Jerusalem, and that we would see different people in the New Testament dealing with. So basically, what you have in Roman society is you have this emperor at the top, slaves at the bottom. So just beginning at the very bottom with the foundation, if you will, of Roman society, you have these slaves. Um, for those of you on the phone hookup, I have this pyramid on my screen and I will read from bottom to top. So the slaves, they are, they have no rights. If you're a slave, you could be beaten, you could be whipped, you could be kicked in the teeth, and you're a slave. You have no rights. You can't take your owner to court or anything like that. Uh, Maybe you might think about Paul talked about being in slavery, not himself, but other people being slaves. And he said, well, you know, if you're called as a slave, don't make it your aim to try to free yourself. And we shouldn't take that as Paul saying it's good to enslave people, because some people did say that back in the early 1800s. They said, well, Paul said if you're a slave, don't try to be free, so it's okay to be a slave owner. Well, that's not what Paul was getting at. He's saying, you know, do what you can in the circumstances you find yourselves. If you're in prison, if you're a slave, if you're a woman, a male, whatever it is, do the best you can with what you've been given. That was Paul's message. Now, in the Roman Empire, in the Roman society, um, this is where most of the manual labor would have come from. Would have been performed by the slaves. And you could be enslaved if you were born, if your parents were slaves and you were born, you'd be born a slave. If if your family or your nation or your province was somewhere and it got captured by the Roman Empire, you could conceivably, in some instances, if you tried to fight back, you could be made a slave. If you made poor life decisions and found yourself in debt, you could sell yourself into slavery, or you could be thrown into jail and could become a slave until you could get out of debt. You'll remember that parable of Jesus Christ with um, the servants, and the one was forgiven of his great, incredible debt, and then the other one, that one who was forgiven of his debt, said, "Oh, well, my servant just had a tiny 1% of what I owed. Throw him in jail until he could pay it all back." Um, that is, or that's something you could do. You could serve as a slave and you could still earn money. You could still have possessions, but you had no rights. And so, um, not a great thing to be a slave, although scholars believe that up to a third of people in Rome could have been slaves under the Roman Empire. You could pay to get out of slavery, but it would take many years. I have women on here on this list, and it's not that women were a rank that you would attain to, although in modern society, I suppose you could be a woman if you want to. But in the first century, you don't get to choose what you are. If you're born a woman, you are a woman. However, women were viewed as inferior to men. Women had no rights of their own, regardless of which class they were a part of. They had no formal role in public life. Um, However, they were above slaves because they were Roman citizens, but they didn't have any duties or functions in Roman society as a rule. Now, by the end of the first century, this did begin to change a little bit, and women began to gain more freedom. There were a few anomalies in the that served as empresses, but they weren't really empresses. They were stand-ins, perhaps for their children or somebody died or whatever the case may be. But for all intents and purposes, women didn't have any rights. Now, next you had freedmen. Now, freedmen were ones who paid to get out of slavery. You see them mentioned a number of times in the Bible, and they could become craftsmen, they could become traders, they could own small farms, they could own shops. If they were formally released from slavery, they would get full Roman citizenship. They would have the same rights as, um, well, they would have the same rights as the plebeian class, which we'll get to momentarily. I'm just going to shrink this down here for a second. Let's see if this works. There we go. And these freedmen, they would retain any property that they had gained, but they just wouldn't be able to be eligible for public office. Now, they would get this full Roman citizenship if they were formally released from slavery. If it was just kind of a handshake deal and something done informally, they wouldn't get all the rights. They would be freed, but they wouldn't get to take any of their property with them. They wouldn't get the some of the other rights that Roman citizens got. And we'll talk about that momentarily, some of those rights. Now, the next class is these plebeians. And, excuse me, in today's society, you may hear that word plebe, and it's not really used in a very nice sense because it kind of just means an average person. But it's not meant to be a demeaning term. In Roman society, that's what you were. All you people online tonight, with the exception of maybe half a dozen of you, you are all plebes. You're all plebeians. That's the lower class, just the average working citizen, just the normal everyday person. It's not a demeaning term at all. But there was a big gap between the plebeians and the upper class, the equestrians, senators, patricians, and certainly the emperor. And these plebeians, they were able to marry the patricians, the next class. They could be shop owners, farm owners, talking about larger farms. They could be bakers, builders, all those sort of things. They could be retired soldiers. These plebeians, they were able to hold public office and they could serve on the council of the plebes. And that's a certain council that would confer with the senatorial class and the patrician, the ruling classes. Um, these plebeians, they were able to vote. Now, they didn't have very much political power, but because the majority of the Romans were of the plebeian class, they could, and they often did. Now, this isn't a right, this is just a matter of fact. The plebeians often rebelled against the upper classes. Well, we don't like the way they have more money than we do. We don't like how we do more of the work than they do. Let's rebel. So they did that sometimes. Uh, Roman citizens did have many rights. Now, they were exempt from torture, they were exempt from mistreatment by authorities, theoretically. We saw that with Paul. They had a right to a fair trial. They were exempt from provincial taxes. They had rights to obtain property. They had a right to legally marry. Um, of course, there are a lot of rights. This is just a brief overview. I've given lists in other studies, but in within this right to legally marry, so a slave could marry, right? But in the plebeian class, they had a right to legally marry. It was on record, and that would then secure the inheritance rights for their children. Their children would be legitimate within Roman society. Also, these members of the plebeian class, they had a right to serve in the Roman army. And you may think, oh, well, is that really a right? Well, yeah, it was, because then they would receive military benefits. They could receive certain rewards. Some of the people in military could be rewarded with being elevated to a higher social status if they served well. Uh, Paul was likely of this plebeian class. Now, most plebeians were relatively uneducated, There wasn't a lot of education by and large, given the size of that class. Most were unable to read and write, although many were. But what set Paul apart was he was of Jewish heritage, and the Jews valued very highly certain standards of living. We see that throughout the ages. Uh, there were times when people would get deathly ill, huge plagues would happen, and oh, well, all of a sudden, these Jews must be practicing magic because they're not getting sick. Well, no, they washed their hands. Uh, we understand that today. Uh, but Jews also, they wanted their children to understand and to memorize parts of God's laws because they would have the Mishnah, they would have these things the oral law, things that were passed down. Hey, remember, our ancestors went into slavery. We need to memorize God's laws so we don't go back there. So they would have their children learn these things. So Paul, as a Jew, he would have likely, and as part of the diaspora, would have likely had some other opportunities that some of the Jews in other parts of the world may not necessarily have had. But by and large, the Jewish people believed generally in instructing their children in the Old Testament. So they had maybe more opportunities for education than some of other people in the Roman society may have. Now, another reason why we say that Paul was probably part of this class, this class of this social hierarchical structure of Roman society is that he was a tent maker. So we see several times Paul mentioned as a tent maker, and the the higher upper class, they are not slaving away in the sun or working hard in the sun making tents, working with dead animal carcasses. The slaves, well, they don't generally have freedom to just move about how they want. Uh, Paul did, and he also had some unique opportunities. So seems to be that he was probably part of this plebeian social class. Now, um, provincial citizens of captured Roman territories could, in some cases, purchase Roman citizenship. Not always, but in many cases, some cases it was given to them freely, but sometimes it was offered to them that they could purchase or buy their way into it. I just want to turn back a page or two in your Bibles to Acts 22, verse 26 through 29. So we just recently read this. Acts 22, verse 26 through 29. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do. This man is a Roman." Then the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. So the commander was most likely probably some sort of elite from a conquered province whose family or himself had been given an opportunity to purchase Roman citizenship. Now that's uh, it's speculative, but it's based on biblical precedent. So we're not expressly told that, but it seems likely. So next in this social hierarchical structure is the equestrian class, just like you'd think of horses. Well, there's a reason for that. The equestrians were the Roman cavalry. They were originally they were originally the Royal Mounted Knights, and they were at their inception, originally how it worked out is they were given money to purchase and care for their horse or horses throughout their career. Now, later on, that equestrian class evolved and it had begun to evolve now. Uh, and they began to be associated with commerce. The equestrians were associated with trade. Eventually, the equestrian class formed part of the upper class that would deal with business. And in this equestrian class would be bankers. You would find tax collectors among the equestrian class. You would also find miners, people who owned and operated mines for precious metals, as well as trading house owners and owners of import-export businesses. So all these people, these aren't just people running a shop on the street per se. These are well-known, successful business owners. So, in today's society, it wouldn't be somebody that's like a handyman that goes and has his own business and works for himself, but like somebody who owns their own construction company, has, you know, many trucks with their name on the side, and they manage all that sort of thing. So somebody a little bit a step above. Uh, and that evolved into this over time. Now, equestrians, they were able to become senators. Any Roman citizen, any plebeian, any Roman citizen could become an equestrian so long as they had attained a certain level of wealth. That certain level of wealth was they had to have at least 400,000 Roman sesterces. So you may be saying, what on earth is a sesterce? Well, a sesterces is worth or was worth roughly 50 cents. So an equestrian would have had to amassed at least $200,000. They would have had to have been in good health. They would have had to have had a good reputation in order for them to become an equestrian or join this social rank. Now, there's probably one that you are more familiar with than others. Who is that? Well, we know who it is. Hang on one second here. And that one is a guy named Matthew. So, wanted to just call your attention, and I have it up on the screen. If you are on the phone hookup, you could reference Matthew 9, Mark 2, and Luke 5. Matthew 9, Mark 2, and Luke 5. These are sections of scripture where it talks about and where we're introduced to Matthew, the tax collector. Now, Matthew, the tax collector, I want to just highlight Matthew 9, verse 9 for a second. So it says, Jesus passed on from there, saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office. He said to him, "Follow me." Matthew arose and followed him. Well, that's interesting. Good for him. Mark, let's see. It says, Jesus, he passed by, saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, said to him, "Follow me." He arose, followed him. Great. Same account. Matthew sounds like a good guy. But hang on a second. Let's just zoom in on your screen here. Luke chapter 5, verse 27 through 29. After these things, he went out, saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office. He said to him, "Follow me." He left all, rose up, followed him. Levi gave him a great feast in his own house. There were a number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. And so I wanted to emphasize the fact that, you know, uh, Jesus Christ talked about how difficult it was for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to remember that in this time of the world history, um, it is tough to be alive. All right, if you um, don't have money to get by, you can't just take a credit card and pay it off next month. I mean, if you can't get by, you die, or you become a slave, or you steal and you go to jail and then you die. So it's a hard living. Matthew had somehow attained to a great deal of money, not just a great deal of money, but a great job. Now, sure, he was looked down on in Jewish society as maybe a traitor, but that aside, he's getting money. I mean, he has a lot of money coming in. and he's giving all that up. Now, whether or not he gave up the money that was in his bank account, we're not sure, but he left his whole profession behind. He's no longer making money in that way. And those tax collectors, and I don't want to go into that, but they would have to bid on the position of tax collector. And then the highest bidder would get it, and they would essentially they would set the taxes because they were responsible for paying a certain amount for a certain region they were over, and then they could set the rates as high as they could extort, and they'd keep the difference. And so Paul would often talk about, hey, you tax collectors, if you're going to do that, or Jesus would talk about that, if you're going to do that, fine, but set a rate that's not exorbitant. Set a reasonable rate. Don't try to money gouge. Um, and so Matthew is leaving this life of wealth and luxury behind to go hang out with a carpenter and a bunch of stinky fishermen. Oh, well, maybe they weren't stinky, but they didn't have showers the way we do today, so they probably didn't smell great. And here Matthew is leaving the life of an equestrian. I mean, he is in the upper ruling class of society, and now he's going to go traipse around with a guy he's going to get himself killed. So, worth mentioning that Matthew uh, had a lot to his name and he gave up a lot. So we can gain a little bit of a deeper insight, understanding just what Matthew would have given up here. So next class here is the senators. So the senators would have been Roman citizens who were aged 25 and above. And the senators, they would have also had to have had military experience. In order to be a senator, you would have had to have had administrative experience. And there is an entire subcategory that makes up this branch of Roman government. We are not going to talk about that tonight. However, senator is at the top of that subcategory. The senators were unable to be directly involved in business because it was a conflict of interest. Now they could buy and sell stuff, normal stuff, but they couldn't be the ones who set the rules for business. The senators controlled Roman politics, controlled the government. They could hold a position of judge, and the senators must have amassed a certain degree of wealth, similar to the equestrians, except not just 400,000 sesterces. They would have had to have amassed at least 1 million sesterces. So $500,000 in today's money, plus property. So they would have been fairly wealthy in order to rule. They began, the senators. I also don't want to go into this today because you may not care and it's tangential. But if you go back to Julius Caesar, that's kind of when all that started. He had just a small group. There was a civil war happened, a bunch of them got killed. And so he amped it up and didn't just have a small group, but the senators, they ended up having something like 600 to 900 senator seats. So really bumped it up. It began as an advisory council to the patrician class, which is next in society above this. But over time, it evolved to include some of the people from the equestrian class. So final class in Roman society now are the patricians. And the patricians are the leading noble class. And they are made up of Roman consuls, which is the highest government position, praetors, same word as judges, so made up of consuls, judges, wealthy landowners, also those who descended from Rome's founding fathers. So when you think of a patrician, think of a Benjamin Franklin. Think of the descendants of John Adams. Think of descendants of any of those people who were the founding fathers of America, George Washington or whoever. Those would have been the patricians. Also, some of them could have been appointed by the emperor. If he had a real good friend and wanted to appoint them, he could do that. These patricians, they were excluded from any lower societal duties. If you are in the patrician class, education was stressed for you. If you were a male, these families provided political influence, religious influence, military influence, and they basically led the empire. They also had the ability to veto different laws. Um, Finally, is the emperor. And it's not really a class because you're either the emperor or you're not, plain and simple. So, emperor was superior to the rest of society, and they had a lavish, extravagant lifestyle. Typically, it'd be a hereditary position, but it could be chosen from a patrician class if it was approved by the Senate. And again, there's no term limits for this class. And I got a lot of this information. I mean, it's well known, well documented, but some of my primary sources were Roman-Empire.net and PBS.org, but also many commentaries. Okay, so let's continue on. Verse 2 and 3 now of Acts 25. The high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul. They petitioned him, asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. Um, Almost sounds like they are agreeing with Festus to kill Paul, but that's not the case at all. Contemporary English version says they begged him to do this because they were planning to attack and kill Paul on the way. So clears it up a little bit. They weren't hoping for favor in Festus's eyes. They just wanted to end this thing. Let's get rid of this guy, Paul. He's a problem. Verse 4 and 5. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. I want to read verse 6 as well, actually. So, verse 6 says, and when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. So, this judgment seat, what on earth is that? Well, the judgment seat, this was like a court hearing with Festus kind of acting as a type of judge. And what you see on your screen if you're looking, and what you don't see on your screen if you're on your phone, um, the archaeological study Bible that I have says the Greek word translated judgment seat is bema, B-E-M-A. So what you're looking at here is a bema. Now, a bema, B-E-M-A, it's referred to many times in classical literature, numerous times. It was a raised speaker's platform from which proclamations were read and on which citizens stood to appear before officials. There are a number of different scriptural references to bemas mentioned in my archaeological study Bible, and it goes on to say the Corinthian bema where Paul was tried has been excavated. So that's a picture of it on your screen. It would have been something similar as well in Caesarea. And it says this is a large stone structure at the side of the public market, rising about 7.5 feet above the pavement and originally covered with beautifully carved marble. So that is where this would have been taking place. Verse 7 and 8. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all. So, boy, what a sorry existence. Pretty remarkable. These people, they have nothing better to do in their miserable lives than to just follow Paul around, not even locally. I mean, they're going around the world. Nothing better to do than to just make his life miserable. Verse 9. Verse 9 says, Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? In this scenario, the Sanhedrin would have been present. Uh, he could have just dealt with it now, but he didn't. Festus retained the authority to make the ruling on the outcome of the case. Why the continuous delay? Well, I just want to direct your attention, if you hold your place, back to John 12. John 12 and verse 42 and 43. John 12, verse 42 and 43. So this is about Jesus Christ here, what he's dealing with. And it says, nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they didn't confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For notice, they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Is that what's happening here? Seems to be definitely in the uh, contending player in the reasoning for why Felix, Festus, and other people are acting the way they are. They want to be approved in the eyes of men. They're not seeking to be approved in the eyes of God. Verse 10 and 11. Verse 10 and 11 now. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. If I'm an offender, if I've committed anything deserving of death, I don't object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. So up until now, remember that Festus still had the ability to acquit Paul of the charges made against him, but he chose not to. And I do want to just turn back to Acts chapter 9, verse 15, very briefly. So Acts 9, verse 15. And you'll remember when Paul was first being converted, Acts 9:15, it says the Lord, so Jesus Christ said to him, go, talking to Ananias, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. So Christ told Paul he would bear his name before all these individuals. Went on to tell Paul he was going to suffer for the sake of the gospel. And we're going to see at the end of Acts 26 that Paul, he may even have been let go if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. Well, that's concerning, isn't it? Well, there is a side point here that I think is worth noting. What we see is God's ability to shape and direct world events while ensuring that man retains his ability to exercise free will. God did not force the Jews to try to kill Paul. God didn't force Felix to behave wickedly. God didn't force Festus to be indecisive. All those things, that would go against God's perfect nature of being sinless and God being totally light and in him is no darkness, right? So that would go against the scriptures. Now, scripture also tells us God does not see as a man sees. Scripture tells us God knows the heart. We judge people based on what they do. God judges people based on what they want to do, or evaluates people based on what they want to do. Now, in this instance, Jesus Christ told Paul that he was going to testify before rulers on his behalf. Was that because he was going to force them to listen? Well, no. Knowing people's hearts, God allows people to come into situations where they will have to make a decision. Now, these are not always decisions between good and evil. Sometimes they are. Many times they are. Sometimes it's simply a decision between two good but opposite courses of action. Have you ever been faced with two decisions? You've evaluated them. They're both okay according to Scripture. Which job should I take? They both offer me the same amount of money. One of them's in Watertown, the other's in Sioux Falls. and I live in Fargo, and I already have a job. You know, not bad decisions, but different decisions. And so God allows people to come into different situations where they will have to make a decision. Um, in this instance, God knew Festus. God had watched Festus since the day he was born. He knew his likes, he knew his dislikes, he knew his desires, his heart's desires. And after years of observation, however, years before Paul found himself here, God was well aware of Festus's pattern of decision making. Now, at this time, God could have intervened to free Paul from captivity while he was traveling to Caesarea. God could have sent a vision to Felix. He could have sent a vision to Festus. He could have instructed them, hey, let Paul go. He didn't. He didn't. Uh, Paul wasn't delivered. Instead, he was brought before these individuals. Why? Well, God knew if he didn't intervene to divinely remove Paul from the situation, Felix would behave how he had always behaved, shrewdly and for self gain. And yeah, we see that. He had a history of it. Festus would behave how he had always behaved, with deliberation, with uncertainty, to ensure his own political stability, yet with somewhat of a more balanced approach. Did he do that? Yes, he did. He had a history of that. That was what he was known for. This seems to be something that Paul recognized years later. And if you'll just join me over in Philippians 1 for a second. Philippians 1, verse 12 through 14. This is Paul writing about 1 to 3 years later after this account in Acts, after this very account is happening. Philippians 1, verse 12 through 14, he wrote, "But I want you to know, brethren, the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard, to all the rest, that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." As is often the case in our lives, it's not always evident just why God allows us to go through trials. God, this is awful. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? Sometimes we can get discouraged. Months down the road, years down the road, we look back in hindsight, and if we're honest with ourselves, we can usually see God's hand at work in our lives, can't we? We can see his hand allowing us to come into situations where our faith would be tested, where we would be strengthened in our faith, and where the good news of his kingdom had an opportunity to be shared, um, and where his name could be glorified. We often can see that when we look back. Verse 12, Acts 25. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go." Now, the Caesar at this time would have been Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero reigned or ruled from 54 to 68 AD. Excuse me here. Verse 13. After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. I have um, an audio Bible that I listen to sometimes. I just have to mention this because it's the most absurd thing. It has nothing to do with this uh, Book of Acts account, other than the fact that the narrator reads so wonderfully. He's got a charming voice. It's a joy to listen to him, and he has determined to pronounce names in the most ridiculous manner that you ever heard of. And so, there's a YouTube video going around where this black school teacher substitute comes in and he's like, "Hey, Aaron." And the guy's name's Aaron. Um, anyway, this particular narrator doesn't say Bernice. He says, uh, Bernice, Bernice. That is ridiculous. Anyway, so going on, just want to mention to you about King Agrippa and Bernice, is how we're going to pronounce her name. And maybe you'll find this kind of interesting. And it just, maybe you think to that scripture where it says things that are done in secret are going to be shouted from the rooftops. Uh, See if that applies to tonight's scenario. King Agrippa, my archaeological study Bible says, was also known here, this King Agrippa, as King Agrippa or Herod Agrippa II. So there were other Herods, other Agrippas as well. Agrippa, I think, is the family name. Herod is the title. So this King Agrippa here, Herod II, Herod Agrippa II, he was 17 years old at the death of his father, Herod Agrippa I, or Herod the Great, or Herod the Builder, in AD 44. Now, this Herod II, he was too young to succeed his father, and so he was replaced by Roman governors. 8 years later, his territorial authority began to extend. Ultimately, he ruled over the territory of that was north or northeast of the Sea of Galilee. He also ruled over several Galilean cities and over some of the cities in Perea. Now, at the Jewish revolt, when Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, he was on the side of the Romans, and he died about 100 AD. He was the last of the Herods. So kind of interesting. But what's real interesting is the person he came with, Bernice. Who's Bernice? Well, Bernice was what they call a Jewess. She was Jewish. This is one of Drusilla's sisters. And Holman's Study Bible says Herod Agrippa II visited Caesarea with his sister, Bernice, who had a checkered sexual and marital history. Huh. And I read that and I said, I have got to find out a little bit more about that. And so I looked at some other sources, and my archaeological study Bible said Bernice was the oldest daughter of Herod Agrippa I. So this is her brother that she's traveled here with. Also, her sister was the previous governor's wife, who also had a terribly uh, misguided sexual past, Drusilla. Now, this woman here, Bernice, according to Josephus, was first married to Marcus, and then he died. Then she became the wife of Herod of Chalcis, who was her uncle, her dad's brother. After he died, she lived with this guy that she traveled here with, Herod Agrippa II. He was her brother. Later on, they formed an incestuous relationship, so they started hooking up. Later on, she left him and was married to Polemo of Cilicia. However, that marriage was very short, and then she returned back to her brother into his bed. Uh, then later on, that wasn't enough for her, and she became the mistress of Vespasian and Titus before being cast aside. So, yeah, talk about a checkered history and things being shouted from the rooftops. Boy, that pretty checkered past. All right, verse 14 and 15. And we will be going through the rest of this chapter fairly quickly. There's some sections where we cover a lot of verses. We may just go a couple minutes over time, though. But we did start a few minutes late, so that's what I'm going with. Verse 14 and 15. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. So Festus did outrank King Agrippa, but he valued still his opinion. Now, let me just see. I don't think I want to read this, but maybe I'll just mention that Agrippa was king over a small part of Palestine, but he owed his position to the Romans. They had put him there. And so it was his custom to pay a courtesy visit to the Roman governor when he entered his province. So this is Barclay saying that. And so King Agrippa and his wife, they would have had some information about and understanding about the Jewish laws and rules and society. Verse 16 through 19 now. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face, and has an opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together, without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So at this point, Christianity was still considered to be part of the Jewish religion. And as we've talked about a number of times, that is important. And it's important because it would have been very problematic for Paul if he had been accused of inventing a new religion. And so Festus here, he presents a very unbiased explanation of the series of events. And he seems to have grasped in layman's terms the gist of the situation. Verse 20 through 23. Verse 20 through 23. Because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So the next day, verse 23, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. Now, I don't have it up on the screen, but the word in Greek for pomp is phantasia, so spelled with a PH. So like that Disney movie, Fantasia, this is the Greek word Fantasia, Phantasia, Fantasia. And it comes from this old word, fantasy. The old word was with a PH. Now we spell it with an F, but it meant the process of creating especially unrealistic mental images in response to psychological need. So basically, it's saying they needed the attention, and it was ingrained in their psyche. So these are very emotionally needy individuals. And we see that in their history, all their sexual exploits and things like that. They needed attention. Other words to describe this word in Greek for pomp are a vain show, a great show, parade, and splendor. So, big deal, a very big deal. Adam Clarke's commentary notes this, which you may find interesting. He says, these children of Herod the Great made this pompous appearance in the very city where, just a few years prior, their father for his pride was smitten by God and eaten up by worms. How seldom do the living take any of God's judgments to heart. Boy, isn't that the truth? So we come now to the auditorium. This is no longer a trial. The trial's over because Paul appealed to Caesar. He's going to Rome. There's no Jews now present to accuse him. So this is just a matter of curiosity about Paul's religion that they wanted to meet with him. Verse 24 through 27 now, end of the chapter. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are here present with us. And so these would have been those ruling classes. So the equestrians and the different senators and the patricians and all these different people like that. Not necessarily all of them, but from those classes. You see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me. both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. Holman's Study Bible says, and this is the last point we'll kind of wrap up with, Festus had not previously made it known publicly that he thought Paul was innocent. Since Paul had made his appeal to Caesar, Festus was now free to admit, without repercussion, that he believed the charges were groundless. And so we even see here a bit of unbiased character in Festus, saying things like, it doesn't seem right to me to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. So Festus was characteristically known as being less unbiased, known for being a better administrator than his predecessor and a better administrator than his successor. The name escapes me of who I think it was Albonius or Albinus was his successor, and he was better than both of them. So next time we'll get into Acts 26, and we'll see Paul's case presented in great detail before Festus, before Agrippa, and before Bernice. So that's it for tonight's Bible study. Also, before I turn off the recording, want to just share the discussion questions before we open it up. So for anyone who will stick around, the questions are, number one, what does Festus's desire to, quote unquote, do the Jews a favor in Acts 25, verse 9, reveal about the temptation leaders face to prioritize popularity or personal gain over justice? And as future leaders in the world tomorrow, how can we apply this lesson in our own areas of influence? Second question is, Festus admits to King Agrippa in Acts 25, verse 26 and 27, that he has nothing certain to write about Paul's charges. What does this reveal about the dangers of passing judgment without understanding the truth? And how can we guard against this in our own decision making and leadership? So, 2 questions related to leadership. And if you can't stick around, thank you for tuning in. Otherwise, we'll open it up now to some answers.